Welcome to the debate. Today, we are not just discussing a philosopher, we are, in a way, discussing the architect of the Western mind. We're stepping back to Athens, specifically around 427 BCE, to examine Plato. If you've ever wondered why we distinguish between the mind and the body, or why we look for perfect solutions in a messy world, you're effectively thinking in the language that Plato created.
And it's often said that all Western philosophy is merely a series of footnotes to Plato. That's a massive legacy, undeniable in its scope. But the question we need to wrestle with today is whether that legacy is actually good for us. We're looking at a man who casts a very, very long shadow, but we have to ask if that shadow has obscured reality rather than illuminated it.
That is the central tension we're here to explore. The question before us is this. Does Plato's philosophy represent the ultimate form of courage, the bravery to reject superficial appearances and seek eternal truth? Or was his entire worldview a traumatized, knee-jerk reaction to the politics of his time, leading to a detached, elitist fantasy that, simply cannot function in the real world?
I'm arguing the latter. I see Plato not as some mystical visionary who cracked the code of existence, but as a man deeply burned by the world, specifically by the execution of his teacher, Socrates. I'll argue that this trauma drove him to retreat into a cave of his own making, a world of impossible ideals and anti-democratic politics that required the scientific realism of his own student, Aristotle, to actually make sense of human existence.
And I'm here to defend the position that Plato is the ultimate visionary. He correctly identified that the physical world, the things we touch, see, and obsess over, are merely shadows of a deeper reality. I argue that his theory of forms and his educational system were not a retreat, but a necessary, rigorous training of the soul. He wasn't running from reality. He was trying to drag humanity out of the mud and towards the light.
A noble goal, certainly. But as we'll see, the light can be blinding, and sometimes you need to watch where you're walking so you don't fall off a cliff.
Let's start with the man himself. To understand Plato's choice, we have to understand what he walked away from. He wasn't some hermit born in a barrel like Diogenes. He was born into the highest echelon of Athenian aristocracy. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from the early kings of Athens. His mother, she was related to Solon, the legendary lawgiver. This man had wealth, status, and a clear path to political power just laid out before him. He could have been a general, a senator, a ruler.
He essentially had the golden ticket of Athenian society. He was tall, broad-shouldered, Plato literally means broad, and, likely a wrestler. He was built for the podium and the battlefield.
Exactly, and he threw it all away. Or rather, he traded it. He realized early on that the standard metrics of success, power, wealth, military victory were hollow. He looked at the chaos of his time and realized that, education is not enough and power is not enough if you don't know how to think. He gave up a life of easy command to build the academy, a place focused entirely on the rigorous, abstract training of the mind. That isn't cowardice, that's a massive sacrifice.
I don't deny his intelligence or his sacrifice of status. But you have to look at the context of why he made that pivot. You mentioned the chaos of his time. He grew up during the Peloponnesian War. This wasn't a minor border skirmish. This was a 27-year catastrophic conflict between Athens and Sparta that just shattered Athenian society. He saw democracy, the great pride of Athens, collapse into mob rule, paranoia, plague, and eventually defeat.
Which surely validates his skepticism of the mob, does it not? I mean, if you watch your society implode because of poor leadership and emotional voting, wouldn't you look for a better way?
It explains it, but I don't know if it validates the extreme reaction he had. His sacrifice wasn't just a noble pursuit of wisdom, it was a rejection of the systems that governed his fellow citizens. He didn't just step back to think, he stepped back because he hated the game. And the catalyst for that hatred wasn't just the war, it was Socrates. You simply cannot separate Plato's philosophy from the trauma of watching his mentor die.
I agree that Socrates is the spark, but look at why Socrates died. This is the crucial point. Socrates was the wisest man in Athens, a man who walked around barefoot asking people, "Do you believe you are wise?" He stripped away their pretenses. He exposed that the politicians didn't know what justice was, and the poets didn't know what beauty was. And how did the democratic jury of Athens respond? Did they thank him for the audit? No. They voted by a margin of 30 votes to execute him.
They did. It was a miscarriage of justice, absolutely. A hysterical reaction to a man who was essentially a public nuisance, not a traitor.
It was more than a miscarriage of justice. It was proof of a systemic failure. Plato watched the common man vote to kill the only person asking genuine questions about virtue. That is the moment Plato realized that democracy without education becomes chaos. It wasn't that he hated the people, it was that he saw that a voting populace governed by fear and emotion rather than reason is dangerous. His move away from public life was a moral stance against a corrupt system.
But that trauma warped his conclusion. He didn't just conclude we need better education. He concluded the average person cannot be trusted. It led him to the concept of the philosopher king, this idea that only a select, hyper-educated elite are fit to rule, and everyone else should just stay in their lane. It's the ultimate ivory tower mentality. He equated political dissent with ignorance. He essentially said if you aren't a philosopher, you have no business in government.
Well, I think you're mischaracterizing the philosopher king. It wasn't about power for the sake of power. Plato used the metaphor of the ship of state. If you're on a ship in a storm, who do you want at the helm? Do you want the most popular person, the richest person, or do you want the person who knows navigation, the stars, and the currents?
You want the expert, obviously.
Exactly. Plato's argument was that governance is a skill, just like navigation or medicine. If you're sick, you don't take a poll of your neighbors to find a cure. You go to a doctor who has studied the human body. Plato was asking, why do we treat the health of the state with less rigor than the health of the body? He wasn't saying, I hate the people. He was saying, we need to train the souls of the leaders if we want a just society. That is a meritocratic argument, not a tyrannical one.
That medical analogy is seductive, and he uses it brilliantly. I'll give him that. But it's dangerous. Politics isn't medicine. It's about competing interests and values, not a single biological truth. But let's look at this training he proposed. This brings us to the core of his philosophy in the academy. You call it a training of the soul. I call it a dismissal of reality. He spent 40 years teaching the theory of forms. Can we just clarify for the listeners exactly what that is? Because it sounds mystical, but he meant it quite literally.
It's the most important concept in his work, and you're right, often the most misunderstood. The theory of forms is the idea that the world we experience through our senses, the chair you're sitting in, the microphone in front of us, even, the dog barking outside, is unstable. It changes, it decays, it dies. Therefore, it cannot be true reality in the highest sense. Plato argued that for every physical object or concept, there is a perfect, eternal form or blueprint in a higher realm of existence. There's a form of the chair, a form of justice, a form of beauty.
Right. So the chair I'm sitting on isn't real. It's just a shadow of some ghost chair in the sky.
It's a shadow in the sense that it is an imperfect copy. Think of a circle. You have never seen a perfect circle in your life. Every circle drawn by a human hand or a computer has some flaw if you zoom in enough. But you know what a circle is. You understand the concept of the perfect circle. Where does that knowledge come from? It comes from the mind, accessing the form of the circle. Plato says the physical world is just us trying to draw that circle in the sand, while the true reality is the mathematical concept itself.
And this leads to the allegory of the cave, which is perhaps the most famous image in all of philosophy. It's a powerful story, but I do want to dismantle it a bit. Plato asks us to imagine prisoners chained in a cave, facing a blank wall. Behind them is a fire, and puppeteers walk behind them holding up objects, casting shadows on the wall. The prisoners watch these shadows and think, this is reality. That shadow is a tree. That shadow is a bird.
And the philosopher is the one who breaks the chains.
Precisely. The philosopher breaks free, turns around, sees the fire, which hurts his eyes, and then is dragged out of the cave into the sunlight. He sees the real tree, the real bird. The sun represents the form of the good. But here's the kicker. When he goes back down to tell the prisoners, hey, those are just shadows. Come see the sun. They don't celebrate him. They think he's crazy. His eyes are unadjusted to the dark, so he stumbles. They conclude that going up ruined his eyes. They might even try to kill him, just like they killed Socrates.
It's a perfect description of the burden of knowledge. And the academy was designed to be that climb out of the cave. It wasn't just memorizing facts. It was about geometry, astronomy, and ethics training, the mind to see the abstract truth behind the messy appearance. Above the entrance to the academy, it reportedly said, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Why? Because geometry forces you to think about abstract truths, not just physical things.
It is a beautiful metaphor, I will grant you that. It captures the feeling of intellectual discovery perfectly. But is it practical? You mentioned the academy lasted 900 years, which is impressive. But look at the curriculum. It was obsessively focused on the abstract. And even his prize student, Aristotle, eventually had to kind of call nonsense on it.
Aristotle studied there for 20 years. He clearly saw value in it. He didn't just walk out after the first semester.
He stayed, he learned, but he also dismantled it. Aristotle eventually diverged from Plato on this exact point. There's a famous fresco by Raphael, The School of Athens. In the center, you have Plato pointing up to the sky, to the forms. Next to him is Aristotle, holding his hand flat, palm down toward the earth. Aristotle was saying, the truth is here. He wanted to classify biology, look at starfish, examine politics as it actually existed, use logic on what we can see and measure. He found Plato's view too mystical. If the smartest student in the history of your school thinks your head is too far in the clouds, maybe it is.
I disagree that Aristotle dismantled it. I think he built upon it. Look, you need both perspectives. Aristotle was the organizer of practical reality. Yes, but Plato was the dreamer of eternal truths. You cannot organize reality if you don't first ask what the purpose of it is. Aristotle categorized the world, but Plato gave us the reason to care about it. And let's not forget the lineage. Aristotle's student was Alexander the Great. The mind that conquered the known world was shaped by the lineage of the academy. Plato's influence wasn't just mystical, it shaped empires.
That is a fair point on lineage, but since you brought up empires, let's talk about when Plato himself tried to shape an empire directly. You claim he wasn't detached, that he wanted to fix the world. But when he actually tried to apply his theories to a real government, it was an absolute disaster. I'm talking about his trips to Syracuse.
I was hoping you would bring up Syracuse. To me, the Syracuse episodes prove his courage, not his failure.
Okay, well, let's set the scene for the listeners. Plato is already famous. He travels to Sicily to tutor Dionysius II, the young tyrant of Syracuse. The plan was to turn this spoiled, powerful young man into a philosopher king. It was the ultimate test case for his book, The Republic. And what happened?
He went into the lion's den. He didn't stay safe in the olive grove at the academy. He risked his life to teach a tyrant that power without wisdom is dangerous. He tried to mold a ruler who loved justice more than control. That is the action of a man brave enough to try to shape reality, not just write about it.
Brave or delusional? He went there and the court ate him alive. It was full of intrigue, jealousy, spies. Dionysius was not interested in geometry or the form of the good. He was interested in maintaining his power and, well, partying. Plato's friend Dion ended up exiled, and Plato himself was essentially imprisoned, accused of plotting against the throne. There are even accounts that he was nearly sold into slavery on his way home.
Which speaks to the danger of the time.
It speaks to his naivety. It proves that the philosopher king is an impossible ideal. You cannot just take a ruler and lecture them into virtue. Plato didn't understand the gritty, dirty mechanisms of actual political power. He walked into a snake pit holding a geometry textbook and was surprised when he got bitten.
He walked into a snake pit because he believed that someone had to try. The failure lies with Dionysius, not with Plato. It brings us back to his core realization. If leaders aren't trained in wisdom, you get chaos. The disaster in Syracuse didn't prove Plato's diagnosis was wrong, it proved it was right. Dionysius was a disaster because he refused the training. It highlights exactly why the educational mission was so urgent.
Or it highlights that the training is incompatible with the nature of power. But I think even Plato realized he had overreached. If you look at the evolution of his writing, you see a shift. He spends his life writing the Republic, this highly idealistic vision. But then, at the very end of his life, around age 80, he writes the Laws. And this is a very different book.
It is certainly denser. It lacks the poetic flair of his earlier work, for sure.
It's massive. And it's not about philosopher kings anymore. It's about rigid codes, specific punishments, how marriage should work, how to stop corruption, even how much wine people should drink. It's almost an admission of defeat. It feels like he's saying, okay, since we can't have perfect souls ruling us, we need ironclad laws to restrict us. It's a pivot from idealism to a kind of grim pragmatism.
I see why you would frame it as a defeat, but I view it as perseverance. Imagine this man, 80 years old, likely knowing he's dying, still working to solve the problem of human governance. He didn't abandon his principles. He refined them. The Laws shows that he understood that while the soul is eternal, we live in a material world that needs structure. He said we must work hard to accomplish great things. He wasn't admitting he was wrong. He was doing the hard work of translating the ideal into the real. That isn't the sign of a dreamer who gave up. It's the sign of a master who never stopped teaching.
Perhaps. But let's look at what happened to his ideas after he died. You mentioned the academy lasted until 529 CE. That's true. But the world that followed, the Roman Empire, didn't really have time for Plato. They were engineers, road builders, soldiers. They found him too Greek, too abstract. And when Emperor Justinian finally shut down the academy, it was because Christianity was rising and they saw Greek philosophy as pagan and dangerous. Plato's ideas were effectively hunted down. If his truth was so eternal, why was it so easily suppressed in the West for centuries?
Easily suppressed? I think you mean impossible to kill. This is the most incredible part of the story. Yes, the academy was closed. Yes, the books were burned or lost in Europe, but truth finds a way. The scrolls were carried by monks, buried, or taken to the East. It was the Islamic Golden Age that saved Plato.
That is true. We owe a huge debt to the scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba.
Exactly. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, they didn't just translate him, they debated him. They tried to reconcile his abstract God, the One, with their theology. They kept the flame alive while Europe was in the Dark Ages. And then during the Renaissance, those ideas came back. Marsilio Ficino translates them into Latin in Florence, and suddenly, boom, the Enlightenment begins. You have Copernicus, Descartes, Newton, all of them driven by the Platonic idea that there is a deeper mathematical reality behind appearances. Hold on, you're claiming Newton for Plato? Newton's the father of physics, of mechanics. That's Aristotle's territory. That's about observing the apple fall. Not entirely. The scientific method requires observation, yes, but the belief that the universe follows invisible, perfect laws, laws of gravity, laws of motion that can be written in mathematics, that is pure Platonism. The idea that nature is written in the language of mathematics is the ultimate vindication of the forms. You can't see gravity itself. You only see its effects. The law is the form. You cannot kill an idea that fundamental.
I will grant you that the mathematical aspect of Platonism underpins modern science. But look at the culture we live in today. We are dominated by empiricism, by technology, by data. We want proof, not allegories. We want medicine that works, not theories about the form of health. We are living in Aristotle's world. We value the tangible, the consumable.
Do we? Look at our movies. Look at our pop culture. The Matrix, Inception, Interstellar. What are the biggest blockbusters asking? Is this world an illusion? What is real? Is there a soul beyond the physical? Those are Plato's questions, echoing 2,400 years later. Neo taking the red pill is the prisoner leaving the cave. We might live in a technological world, but we are still haunted by the spiritual and existential questions Plato raised. We are still sitting in the cave, watching screen shadows and wondering what is outside.
That's a compelling image, I admit. We've traded the cave wall for the smartphone screen. But I would argue that while Plato asks the best questions, his answers are still dangerous. He teaches us to look for a truth that might not exist, rather than fixing the reality we actually have. If you're always looking for the perfect city in the clouds, you might ignore the potholes in the one you live in.
But if you don't have a vision of what is good or just in the absolute sense, how do you even know the pothole is bad? How do you know what to fix? Plato teaches that excellence is not a gift but a skill that takes practice. He tells us we are responsible for our own happiness, that it comes from inner balance, not external wealth. That is as practical as it gets.
I suppose my final point of concern is his view on death, which is the ultimate test of his philosophy. This is where his idealism peaks. He watches Socrates die and concludes that the soul is a bird trapped in a cage, and death is freedom. It's a beautiful coping mechanism for the trauma of losing his mentor, but it encourages a detachment from this life. If the next world is the real one, why fight so hard for this one?
Because he also said, the price good men pay for not getting involved in politics is to be governed by worse men. He didn't say wait for death. He said get involved. He said contribute to society. He believed the soul was eternal, yes, but he also believed that a just man must be good for others here and now. He reconciled the eternal with the civic duty. That is why he's the teacher of teachers.
I suppose that is the tension that defines him. The man who warns against bad governance, but proposes a system, the philosopher king, that has never successfully existed. He hated the messiness of democracy, but the alternative he proposed was so sterile it couldn't survive contact with reality.
And yet he created the philosopher's citizen. He didn't succeed in making a king a philosopher, but through the academy, he made thousands of citizens philosophers. He created a class of people who valued truth over power.
I will concede that the academy was a monumental achievement, a place where truth mattered more than power. We could certainly use more of that distinct spirit today.
We certainly could. And remember his lesson? Don't rush to lead. Learn, observe, absorb. He spent years just listening to Socrates before he ever wrote a word.
That is true. He respected the process of learning. So as we wrap up, how do you view his final legacy?
I view him as the foundation. You cannot build a house without a foundation, even if that foundation is buried underground and you never see it.
And I view Plato as the great awakener. He is the one who shakes you by the shoulders and demands you look at the world differently. But I maintain that his specific prescriptions, the withdrawal into the forms, the elitism of his politics, were reactions to his specific trauma in Athens. He was the dreamer of eternal truths, yes, but we needed Aristotle to actually organize reality. We needed the student to correct the master to make the world livable.
And I would argue that without the master, the student would have had nothing to organize. Plato's greatest lesson is that the material world is not all there is. He taught us that the soul requires training just as much as the body. Without Plato's insistence on looking beyond appearances, humanity would still be staring at shadows on the wall, mistaking them for reality. He didn't just wake us up, he gave us the map to the exit.
It seems we agree that whether you prefer the ground or the sky, you can't ignore the man who first pointed upward.
Indeed. Whether we criticize him or follow him, the modern mind is a product of the questions Plato started asking in that olive grove in Athens so long ago.
Thank you for listening to this exchange of ideas.
And thank you for joining the debate. Keep asking questions.